My earliest memories of family gatherings were always tinged with a peculiar sense of invisibility. The warm light of the dining room, the smell of my mother's roast chicken, and the low murmur of conversation should have been comforting. But I often found myself on the outskirts, observing rather than participating. My sister, Emily, always seemed to shine in those moments. She had the kind of charm that drew people in effortlessly. My parents adored her in ways that were almost palpable. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I wasn't as naturally outgoing. Maybe I just needed to try harder. But the feeling didn't go away, it grew. Rooted in 1,000 small moments that were easy to overlook on their own, but impossible to ignore when pieced together. Emily always got the best of everything, the newest clothes, the biggest slice of cake, the first pick of vacation activities. When she wanted something, it was as though the entire household pivoted to make it happen. I, on the other hand, learned early on not to ask for much. "You're so independent," my mother would say with a tone that was meant to be complimentary, but often felt dismissive. Independence wasn't my choice, it was my only option. It wasn't that my parents were cruel. They weren't neglectful in any dramatic, headline-grabbing way. They simply preferred Emily. She was the star, I was the steady, reliable one. While she basked in the spotlight, I found solace in quieter corners, often with my grandparents, who never made me feel like an afterthought. My grandparents, on the other hand, had a way of making me feel seen. They lived in a modest but cozy house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by sprawling oak trees and a garden my grandmother tended with the dedication of an artist. My grandfather, a retired accountant, would sit with me on their porch swing and listen to me talk about school, my hobbies, or the books I loved. Unlike my parents, who seemed to measure my worth in comparison to Emily's, my grandparents treated me as though I had value simply by being myself. It was on one of those porch swing conversations that my grandfather told me something I never forgot. "Life isn't always fair," he said, his voice low and steady. "But the way people treat you doesn't define your worth. What you do with your life, that's what matters." I clung to those words as I grew older and the favoritism became more pronounced. Emily's path through life seemed to be paved with gold. She was the prom queen, the sorority president, the darling of every social circle she entered. I, on the other hand, excelled quietly. I graduated college with honors, found a stable job in marketing, and built a life I was proud of, even if it wasn't flashy. Still, every holiday, every family dinner, felt like a reminder that I would never be enough in my parents' eyes. I wish I could say I was surprised when I overheard my parents discussing their will one evening during one of my rare visits home. My father's voice carried from the kitchen to the living room, where I was pretending to scroll through my phone. "It just makes sense," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Emily will put the house to better use. She's always had more of a connection to it." My mother murmured her agreement. "And the savings, well, she'll need it. Her lifestyle isn't cheap. Besides, she's our baby." The word stung more than I wanted to admit. I was their baby once too, wasn't I? My parents had always made it clear that Emily was their favorite. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't just an emotional slight, it was a tangible, irreversible decision that cemented my place, or lack thereof, in their priorities. I left that visit early, claiming I had work to catch up on, and drove the 2 hours back to my small apartment in silence. The injustice of it burned inside me. But more than that, I felt a familiar ache of resignation. Why did I even expect anything different? The only silver lining was the phone call I received from my grandmother later that week. "We've been thinking about you, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm and steady. "Why don't you come by for dinner on Sunday?" Over the next few weeks, I found myself reflecting more on Emily. It wasn't jealousy. Exactly, at least. Not anymore. It was more of a quiet curiosity. How had she become this golden child? The apple of our parents' eye. While I was left to fade into the background. The more I observed her, the more I realized that her life, so polished on the surface, was not as perfect as it seemed. Emily had a knack for living beyond her means. Racking up credit card debt for designer clothes, luxury vacations, and a lifestyle that screamed success, but hid a troubling fragility. My parents bailed her out time and time again. Each rescue reinforcing their belief that she was the one worth investing in. It wasn't just her finances, either. Her relationships were a revolving door of high-drama breakups and fleeting flings. She talked a big game about her career, but often hopped from one job to the next, never quite finding her footing. For all her charisma, Emily relied on others to keep her afloat. In contrast, my own life, though far from glamorous, was steady. I'd learned how to budget, how to save, how to build something stable. I wasn't the kind of person who turned heads at a party, but I was the one people called when they needed help, advice, or simply someone to listen. It was a quiet pride, knowing I'd built my life on my own terms, without anyone handing me the keys. It was during one of my visits to my grandparents' house that the conversation took an unexpected turn. My grandmother had made her famous pot roast, and we were sitting around the dining table, the air filled with the scent of rosemary and garlic. My grandfather leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he began, his tone casual but deliberate, "your grandmother and I have been thinking a lot about the future." I looked up from my plate, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" He exchanged a glance with my grandmother before continuing. "Your parents, well, they have their own ideas about how things should go. But we have ours." My grandmother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You've always been so strong, so independent. We want to make sure you're taken care of, no matter what." They went on to explain that they had set up a trust, one that bypassed my parents entirely. It wasn't about favoritism. They assured me it was about fairness. "We've watched you work so hard," my grandfather said. "You deserve to have a chance, just like anyone else." I didn't know what to say. Gratitude, relief, and a tinge of guilt swirled inside me. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of validation, a quiet reminder that someone in my family believed in me. The rift with my parents came to a head at Emily's birthday party a few months later. It was an elaborate affair, as always, complete with catered food, live music, and a guest list that read like a who's who of their social circle. I had come out of a sense of obligation, knowing my absence would raise more questions than I was willing to answer. At some point during the evening, I overheard my mother talking to one of her friends. "Emily's always been our pride and joy," she said, her voice dripping with pride. "She's accomplished so much. I don't know what we'd do without her." And me. I wanted to scream. What was I, a placeholder? A footnote? The words boiled over before I could stop them. I confronted her, in full view of the party. It wasn't my proudest moment, but years of frustration and pain spilled out in a torrent of anger. My father tried to intervene. My sister looked mortified. And I left the party with tears streaming down my face. It was the last time I set foot in my parents' house. It was a crisp fall morning when I got the call that my grandmother had passed away. My grandfather had died a few years earlier. And losing her felt like losing the last tether to a part of my life where love and acceptance didn't feel conditional. I drove to their house for the last time, knowing the memories held there would now only live in my mind. The funeral was small, intimate, just the way my grandmother would have wanted it. My parents and Emily were there. Of course, their grief mingling with the faint air of expectation. I noticed my mother whispering to Emily during the service, casting furtive glances my way. It didn't take much to guess what they were discussing. My grandparents' will was the unspoken cloud hanging over us all. A week later, I received a call from my grandparents' lawyer. They've asked me to handle the reading of their will, he said. His voice professional but kind. We'd like you to come to the office. The day of the reading. I arrived early, my stomach churning with a mix of grief and apprehension. My parents and Emily arrived minutes later, their expressions carefully neutral, though Emily's eyes carried a glimmer of anticipation. She had always been good at assuming she'd get her way. The lawyer began with the standard formalities, reading through small bequests to charities and friends before turning to the bulk of the estate. He paused, adjusting his glasses, and glanced at me. To our granddaughter, he began, his voice steady. We leave the entirety of our savings, investments, and property, including our family home. A gasp echoed through the room, my mother's. Emily's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before, her composure cracking for the first time in years. My father sat in stunned silence, his hand gripping the armrest of his chair. Meanwhile, I stared at the lawyer, unsure if I had heard him correctly. To ensure fairness, the lawyer continued. We have bypassed our children, believing it is in the best interest of our legacy to entrust it to our granddaughter, who we believe embodies the values we hold dear: hard work, integrity, and resilience. I felt a lump form in my throat. They had really seen me all along. The drive home was surreal. I couldn't shake the image of Emily's face, the anger radiating off her in waves. She had demanded answers, yelling about fairness and loyalty, while my parents sat in stunned disbelief. I hadn't stayed to hear their complaints. There was nothing to say. My grandparents had made their decision clear. And for the first time in my life, I felt vindicated. Over the next few weeks, the fallout began. My parents tried to reach out, their calls alternating between guilt trips and attempts to negotiate. Your grandparents didn't understand the full picture, my mother insisted during one voicemail. Emily needs more support than you do. Emily, on the other hand, didn't bother with niceties. She sent a string of angry texts, accusing me of manipulation, of turning our grandparents against her. Each message felt like a reminder of the rift that had defined our relationship for so long. But this time, I didn't feel the familiar pang of guilt. I had spent years shrinking myself to avoid conflict, staying silent to maintain the peace. Now, for once, I felt free to stand tall. I didn't rush to change my life after the inheritance. The house sat empty for months as I decided what to do with it. At first, it felt strange to walk through its rooms, the walls echoing with memories of holidays, quiet conversations, and laughter. But as the weeks passed, it began to feel like mine, not just a relic of my grandparents' lives, but a space where I could build something new. I sold my apartment and moved into the house, using part of the inheritance to renovate it while keeping its charm intact. My grandparents' investments provided a safety net, allowing me to take risks I'd never considered before. I left my job in marketing and started my own business, something I'd dreamed about for years, but had always been too afraid to pursue. I also began volunteering, using some of the inheritance to fund scholarships for local students who reminded me of myself, hardworking, overlooked, and deserving of a chance. It felt like a way to honor my grandparents' legacy, to ensure their generosity continued to ripple outward. One day, while sorting through my grandmother's old desk, I found a letter addressed to me. The envelope was yellowed with age, the handwriting unmistakably hers. My hands trembled as I opened it, unfolding the pages with care. "Dearest narrator," it began. "If you're reading this, it means we're no longer with you. First, let us say how proud we are of the person you've become. You've faced life's challenges with grace and strength, and we have no doubt you'll continue to do so. We want you to know that our decision to leave you our estate was not made lightly. It wasn't about playing favorites. It was about recognizing the person you are and the life you've built. We've watched you grow into someone who values kindness, hard work, and fairness. We trust you to carry our legacy forward, not just in wealth but in spirit. Remember, you are enough. You always have been. With all our love. Grandma and Grandpa." Tears blurred the words as I read them again and again. In that moment, the weight of years of doubt, pain, and comparison lifted. I had spent so much of my life feeling invisible, wondering if I mattered. Now, I knew without a doubt that I did. The years that followed weren't perfect. My relationship with my parents and Emily remained strained, though I made peace with the fact that not every family can be whole. What mattered was that I had found a sense of self-worth that no one could take away. As I stood in the garden one sunny afternoon, the flowers blooming under a sky as blue as my grandmother's eyes, I felt a quiet sense of contentment. Life wasn't always fair, but in the end, it had given me exactly what I needed. And for that, I was grateful. Life settled into a rhythm after the dust of the inheritance drama began to clear. The house, once filled with my grandparents' warmth, now carried my own touch. It was strange at first, walking into the space and seeing my choices reflected back at me: new furniture, brighter walls, and a garden reimagined with flowers my grandmother loved alongside plants I had always dreamed of growing. I began to find joy in the small things: mornings on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, evenings spent reading in the light of the setting sun, and weekends exploring hobbies I had neglected in my years of working non-stop to prove myself. For the first time, I felt like my life belonged to me. It wasn't just about moving forward, it was about looking back with a new lens. The house was filled with traces of my grandparents, little reminders of the life they had lived and the love they had given. As I sifted through their belongings, I discovered more letters, journals, and photographs. Each piece told a story of their struggles, triumphs, and unwavering belief in fairness. One journal entry from my grandfather struck a chord. "We can't choose how others treat us," he had written, "but we can choose to live with integrity, to do right by the people who matter and, most importantly, to be proud of the person we see in the mirror." That sentiment became a guiding principle in my life. I stopped dwelling on my parents' and Emily's choices and focused instead on my own values. Their favoritism had shaped me, yes, but it didn't define me. I could let go of the bitterness without forgetting the lessons it had taught me. With the stability of my grandparents' inheritance, I had the freedom to think beyond survival. I wanted my life to reflect their values not just in words, but in action. That's how I found myself starting a foundation in their name, dedicated to supporting underprivileged students and families in our community. The foundation began small: scholarships for local high school seniors, mentorship programs, and partnerships with community centers. But as the years passed, it grew into something far greater than I had imagined. Each success felt like a tribute to my grandparents, a way to ensure their kindness and generosity continued to impact others. It wasn't just about giving back, it was about creating connections. Through the foundation, I met people whose stories mirrored my own: overlooked, underestimated, and quietly resilient. Their gratitude and determination reminded me of my own journey, and each interaction reaffirmed that I was on the right path. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents and Emily remained complicated. My parents continued to express their disappointment in the inheritance, though their overt anger faded over time. They reached out occasionally, but our conversations were stilted, filled with awkward attempts at reconciliation that always felt surface level. Emily, however, remained distant. She made no secret of her resentment, occasionally posting passive-aggressive remarks on social media or venting to mutual acquaintances. For a while, it hurt to know that the sister I had once idolized as a child would never see me as anything more than an obstacle to her ambitions. But eventually, I came to accept that her perspective was her burden, not mine. The estrangement wasn't easy, but it brought clarity. I had spent so much of my life chasing approval from people who would never give it freely. Letting go of that need felt like shedding a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. As my foundation grew, so did my circle of friends and colleagues. For the first time, I found myself surrounded by people who appreciated me for who I was, not for what I could do for them or how I measured up to someone else. These relationships were built on mutual respect, shared values, and a genuine sense of connection. One of the most profound friendships I formed was with a fellow foundation director, a woman named Claire. She had her own story of resilience, having built her career after escaping an abusive relationship. Her insight and encouragement became invaluable, and together, we collaborated on projects that combined our strengths and visions. Through these connections, I learned the importance of chosen family. While my biological family remained distant, I found a sense of belonging among people who saw me, valued me, and celebrated my successes without jealousy or judgment. Years later, an unexpected moment brought Emily back into my life. I was hosting a fundraiser for the foundation, a gala held in the same community where we had grown up. To my surprise, Emily walked through the doors, her expression a mix of hesitation and defiance. She looked different, tired, almost fragile. As the evening progressed, she approached me, her usual confidence tempered by an unfamiliar vulnerability. "I didn't come to cause a scene," she said quietly. "I just wanted to see what you've built." Her words caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But as we talked, I realized that life hadn't been as kind to Emily as she had expected. Her financial struggles had deepened, and the support she had always relied on from our parents was no longer enough to sustain her lifestyle. I listened without judgment, though I didn't offer to fix her problems. I had learned the hard way that helping someone who wasn't ready to help themselves only bred resentment. Still, the conversation felt like a step forward, small, tentative, but meaningful. As the years passed, I continued to build a life that honored my grandparents' legacy while forging my own path. The foundation expanded, reaching communities across the state. The house became a home, filled with laughter, love, and a sense of peace I had never known growing up. I still thought about my parents and Emily, but the ache of their rejection had dulled into something softer, a quiet acceptance of the things I couldn't change. What mattered was that I had found my place in the world. A place where I was enough just as I was. One evening, as I sat in the garden, a letter fell from one of my grandmother's old photo albums. It was addressed to both Emily and me. Written long before the drama of the inheritance. To our dear granddaughters, it began. Life is full of twists and turns, joys and sorrows. No matter what happens, remember that you are both loved beyond measure. We hope you find happiness, not in comparison to one another, but in the unique paths you walk. You are both more than enough. Tears filled my eyes as I read those words. They weren't a solution to all the pain, but they were a reminder of the love that had shaped me, even in the hardest times. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a warm, golden light, I felt a sense of closure. My grandparents' love had given me the strength to build a life I could be proud of. And in the end, that was the greatest inheritance of all.